Figuring out. Hi, I suppose I'm going to talk a little bit about the end of the world, more than maintenance purely, and set a bit of a challenge, because I think one of the things is perhaps most of the reality that we see around us is not maintainable, and that I think opens up a very challenging bunch of conversations, and I think the scale of the change that we're facing over the next 10 years, and even the policy rhetorics that we're starting to get, which are, the Labour Party rightly turned around and said this, I think, to announce that they were going to go for net zero by 2030. But actually, what that means in the real world of transferring that conversation to our reality is of an order of extraordinariness that I think we're not really understanding. And even if you look at the IPCC report, actually it's a conservative estimate. The scale of change that we have to do over the next 2 to 3 years is of an order of magnitude that I don't think we're quite realizing the implications of. And the thesis I want to put forward to you is that actually the challenge is no longer going to be fulfilled by what I would call product innovations. Thinking through how we make products, thinking through how we make new services. I think it goes back into the root of how we think about ourselves as a civilization, and what I would call deep code innovations. So innovations deep into the code of society, i.e. what are property rights, i.e. what is nature? Is nature a resource, an infinite resource, or does it actually have a different language and structure to our world? And I think so. The kind of basic talk that I want to discuss for a few moments is actually saying there is something structural happening over the next 10 years, and how do we engage in that structural transformation, and then also look at actually the kind of nature of what I would say, if you're to look at the foundational economies of energy, inorganic matter, information economies, and then also human development economies. These sort of foundational economies are fundamentally different. They actually have different realities to them. Thank you. Perfect, thank you. And they have fundamentally different realities to them. And we often talk about our economy in the same sense. A matter economy and an inorganic matter economy is fundamentally different from an energy economy. And I think we have to treat these as foundationally different. That's a quick summary whilst the slides are being prepared. So I want to talk about this as a great transition. Many of you hopefully have seen this, but I think it's important to viscerally understand the kind of scale of change that we're seeing to our everyday lives. And when we talk about this, actually, this is just places around the world. Everything has just got significantly changed. But it's not just this, it's also understanding when we talk about this, it changes everything around us. So, nutrition levels in our food are declining rapidly. And actually, climate change effects are accelerating that. So what we're seeing is higher levels of carbohydrate production in food, lower levels of nutrition. That's also to do with soil erosion. So don't just look at climate change for the first order effect. Look at the cascading effects that we're likely to see, right? And I think these sort of effects are going to be cumulative and structural. But also, often when we talk about this, it's worth considering this into the context of actually a broader issue. So if you look at sort of 96% of mammals on Earth are actually, are livestock and humans. Only 4% are wild. 4%. That's all the zebras and all the David Attenborough stuff that we see on TV. That's 4% of the world. Yet we perceive it somehow as it's a significant component. So when we talk about this, I think it's really, I think these challenges, it's firstly worth recognizing a key thing. Climate change is a symptom of a structural issue. It's a symptom. And often the emphasis is trying to fix climate change. And I would say that climate change is just a symptom, as is this. At the same time, let's see if this works. At the same time, we are also talking about a foundational shift in the nature of our economy. Our economy, our industrial economy, was largely designed around tangible goods, tangible assets, things that you can see. Stephen Westlake's got a really good talk about this, and has written a very good book about this. But actually, certainly the UK is increasingly one of the largest economies, which is entirely around intangible assets and intangible goods. Intangible goods operate in a fundamentally different economy to tangible assets. Tangible assets, I can buy and sell those. Intangible goods are sunk. They're highly synergistic. They actually can't be separated and sold differently. So when we talk about those things, they're operating differently, and the value is being captured differently. And the value is being captured in stuff like this: land. So this is UK net wealth. And why this is important to see is that for all the hurrah we hear about unicorns and everything else, where is value really being captured? It's land. Land is actually the rent-seeking infrastructure in the system. Land is the infrastructure which has been taking value out of the economy, and in a monopolistic sense. So I think it's worth thinking about these things together, because these things aren't going to happen separately. And if anything else, I would say that, even if you look at the theories of, President Macron, who's mentioned, so all the stuff that's been going on in Paris, you can't deal with climate change without dealing with inequality. So these things are interlinked as a kind of large-scale transition. Labour market issues, transitions, perhaps over-imagined in terms of scales of automation, certainly for the UK economy, but they are an issue. So when you look at these things in a framework together, as opposed to separately, I would like to say that these are symptoms of a failure in how we've imagined our institutions. And we've imagined our institutions since the sort of 70s Enlightenment, Newtonian Enlightenment, in a very particular way. And they are causing, the effects that they're causing are no longer single villains, single systems. Actually, we're all part of the problem, and the effects are causal, sort of cascading. So how do we start to drive change? I think is a really key issue. And in a way, the biggest problem, I would say, is that we're still thinking about trying to solve the problem by patching the kind of outputs. Let's live slightly zero carbon lives. The reality is, I think something ridiculous like 90% of the carbon production is by 4, 5, 6 industries, actually very large scale. So what you start to see is that it's our institutional infrastructure, which is absolutely key, how we've imagined our institutions. The private limited company isn't a truth. It's just an idea that was conceived actually during the times of when global trade and global shipping was being reinvented and colonization was going on. It was an idea of how to protect investors to be able to invest in boats without losing their money on the basis of actually, if the ship sank overseas, they wouldn't lose additional capital. They just lose the capital on the ship itself. So how do we reimagine these institutions is, for me, a big issue. And dealing with some of these things is going to be fundamental. So the kind of conversation I want to bring to the table here is, I think that if we're talking about building a maintenance economy, I think we have to go deep into the system. It won't be fixed from actually the surface level. Because actually, fundamentally, we've designed our economy in a very particular way. So one of the things I get deeply frustrated by is, the kind of discourse around sharing economy, or fractional rent, as I prefer to call it. So, which is basically corporates will own the assets and you can rent it. And this has been kind of really well advanced by circular economy discourse, which is also saying, hey, the assets should be owned, you should only borrow the assets and return them back so they return back to the source. The question is, who owns these assets? And actually, are we taking wealth away from citizens and putting them in the hands of corporations? So yes, the circular economy is great for maintenance and actually renewability of resources, but actually does it create fundamental asymmetries of power between powers of corporation and the powers of actually the power of citizens? So if we want to unpick this, what we have to start to do is reimagine how resources are owned and who owns them. There's already brilliant work going on around the world about where a river owns itself, or a forest which owns itself. A self-sovereign forest, self-sovereign rivers. which actually can start to create new types of relationship of ownership of primary resources, which aren't privately held for shareholder value. So I think these are fundamental to think about. And the kind of thesis I want to put forward to you is the externalities that we see that are the system failures, the reason why, for example, farmers struggle to use organic fertilizer made in biomachines locally is because their insurance product, they require the insurance of that fertilizer being a certain quality. Without that insurance, they risk their crops being insured further down the chain for any losses. So there's a pathway of how you guarantee products all the way through. We found the same with stuff like OpenDesk and WikiHouse. So when we built WikiHouse, open source housing, which you could 3D route anywhere, the key issue was if you wanted to borrow money, you had to be able to create the warranty infrastructure underneath it. And without the warranty infrastructure, actually nobody would financialize it, give you money to borrow, build a mortgage. So underneath this kind of circular economy and the idea of three distributed production, you need also new economies of actually the nature of institutions. So the way we design warranties has to be reimagined. So if you want a repairable product, what you need is an additive warranty. A warranty that can be assembled and deassembled in a clear format to allow goods to be completely circular and repairable. So these type of institutions are fundamental. So when you look all the way through, you get into what I would argue are some of the deep code challenges, and I'll go a little bit through them. So here, in a way, what I want to encourage us to do is to think about the boring things, right? It's often very cool to think about the things that we enjoy, but actually I would argue that certainly what we've learned is actually it was a warranty infrastructure which is problematic. So if you wanted to do, we could do OpenDesk, open source furniture, right, which anyone could print. Now the obvious way to ensure that or to give a warranty was to give it centrally. We could underwrite it, we could build the warranty infrastructure, we could centralize quality control. But as soon as you centralize quality control, right, we have then centralized the pathway for innovation. We have centrally said what is appropriate innovation. If you want to decentralize it, you've got to actually change the architecture of how you compile warranties. And you have to create a platform for the combination of those warranties. So it is underneath the products that is the challenge, and without those warranties, actually the deployment and the cascading on the institutional infrastructure, so even with sensors, actually with a sensor, you need the warranty of that sensor being verified information. Well, who verifies it? How do you do it? Do you do it centrally? How do you create the infrastructure for that to happen in a distributed manner? So underneath the product world, there is a whole bunch of institutions that are actually essential in building and enhancing that economy. So in terms of that, I would argue that there's a boring revolution challenges. I want to give you 5 examples that I think are, for me, are really interesting in how we change the world around us. So we've been doing a lot of work around sort of few things, but I'll mention one. How many of you know the High Line? Right, great. So the High Line cost $278 million to build. $278 million, it was funded partly by state and city, about 70%, 25% by philanthropy, and another sort of 5% by citizens, circa that, those exact figures. Now, here's the really amazing story. If the land value associated to the High Line, so land value adjacent to the High Line, shared just 10% of the land value uplift attributable to the High Line, just 10%. How many months do you think it would have taken to pay for the High Line? Give me some random guesses. 2 months. Any others? 18? Any others? Fortnight. It's 10. In 10 months, you would have paid back the quantum of the High Line. So what it showed for us, and we did the kind of analysis, and I can show you some of the stuff. We've produced a whole blog about this, and we're sort of doing some work around this, so you can look it up. It's called Smart Commons. What you showed was actually that common goods, public goods, create private value, right? It's parks, it's these things. many of the houses in the UK have gone up in value. Right? Everyone goes, oh yeah, my house has gone up in value. Well, if I took your house and moved it to the middle of Nova Scotia, how much is your house worth? Not that much. So where's the value of the house coming from? And for me here are the key words. The value of the house comes from the monopolistic access to public goods that house provides, or that geography provides. The monopolistic access. So what goes up in value, unless you, of course, if you build an extra room, there's a utility value and other things, but if you discount that, what goes up in value is the public goods and access to public goods. And those public goods are labor markets, are amenities, are schools, are transportation hubs. So when house prices have been going up in value, what's actually been going up in value is public goods. And what we've been doing is inadvertently privatizing that public value in the hands of just property owners. So not citizens, we've been taking public value and redistributing it just to property owners. And I think that's an interesting question. Is that the compact we want as a society? And that's a function of how we understand property rights, I would argue. We still understand property rights from a thesis of actually, my land is my property, and my value comes from the resource that a land provides. And the reality is it doesn't. The value of that land doesn't come from the resource it provides. The value of that land comes from actually its controlled access to other resources. So how we construct these things is actually really critical. And if we want to reimagine actually the world, some of these deep codes are open for being restructured. So, imagine if you could unbundle some of the property rights. What would that mean? Should property be self-owned? There's some really crazy stuff being discussed around, actually, could property be self-owned for public interest? Should it be privately held? What does that mean? And what I find interesting is that there are radical conversations going on about this, not just in, I would say, the left domain of economics, but also the right domain of economics. So if you read stuff like Radical Markets, they're proposing actually some pretty outrageous things, very interesting outrageous things built on the thinking of Henry George and sort of some of the kind of other market allocation mechanisms. So there is a recognition, and the word even, the market, is there a market? Can there ever be a market? Are these false languages that actually we deploy and have become used to deploying, which actually no longer function? So there's lots of implications of that which you can test out into the future. Second aspect of this is this kind of idea of governance, and I think this is really, really important. I think one of the things that I've become more and more obsessive about, have I got another 5 minutes or so? Sorry, I have no idea. Perfect, thank you, sorry. One of the other things I've just become more and more obsessive about is architectures of governance and control and all the things that we see around us. And one of the things that you're seeing around us being discussed is regulatory innovation, governance innovation, and all the things around us. Now, code and digitization has a capacity to do two types of things. It has the capacity to do lots of things, but I want to bring to bear two things. So our current regulatory control mechanisms are designed around what is typically called loosely coupled mechanisms. What do I mean by loosely coupled mechanisms? Actually, it's truth. I was speeding because my uncle had passed away in Leicester, and I was speeding to get to him. I got stopped by the police, and I said, "Look, you're speeding. Got a ticket." I was like, "Okay, that's fine. I've got to get to the hospital." He said, "Fine." He said, take it to the judge, and he'll deal with it." I said, "Okay, fine." Now, what happened was when I took it to the judge and explained what I was doing and why I was doing it, what did the judge do? He said, "Don't worry about the speeding. That's it. And why that was, this is called loosely coupled, where you can do an action, but the compliance and the control of it is not tightly coupled. That loose coupling allows for decentralized deviation from the perceived idea of what is right. This is micro-freedoms that are designed. You can also design regulation, increasingly, where you can say, you cannot drive because your car will no longer work over 30 miles per hour. That is regulation as control, right? It controls you from doing anything. So this is a choice of, and the third component is, you can also design actually quite a lot of really interesting mechanisms to not be about control, but by ennobling you, which is inviting you to be better and more conscious about what you're doing. So if you look at what's happening with judges in America, there's some really great work that's been going on, which is when judges were actually given decisions that they were taking, and put into a spectrum of all sorts of other decisions, saying these are other people, how they're taking similar decisions, and shown the spectrum, they self-adjusted what they thought was appropriate in that context. So by making them aware, giving them high-frequency feedback, people were making better high-quality decisions. So if we want to use technology for control or ennoblement, and actually inviting us to be better humans is a choice, and is a choice of actually design. And we have to start also thinking about human ennoblement is quite different. We conflate the idea of a corporation as a sovereign entity is quite similar to a human. We sort of talk about these are incorporated, actually legal entities. But actually a corporation is a piece of machinery. It has humans inside it, but it operates through the optimization of a piece of machinery. Whereas humans operate through acts of ennoblement and other things. So how we optimize governance from a human-to-human world, or a corporation world, or a machine-to-machine world are fundamentally different. And if we start to rethink this is going to be fundamental to transforming how we govern ourselves and how we govern and operate in the world around us. So I think, and this, for me, is really important as we start to think about the kind of deep structuring of the transformational stuff, a change around us. And I would argue the third horizon of governance has to be around ennobling humans. And yes, more effective control of corporations and machine systems, but actually focus on ennobling humans, which I think is going to be critical. And there's lots of interesting stuff that you can see around noise licensing and other things that you can start to reinvent regulation, not as a means of control, but as a means for actually inviting people to behave better. And that, I think, is a real opportunity in terms of everyday experience and living together. Thirdly, I want to talk about, again, I mentioned this already, so I'll do it very quickly. This is the WikiHouse. But actually, again, this point about warranties. If you want to do this, you have to be able to unbundle and build warranties for hackability. And that is a foundational institutional piece of infrastructure, which I don't think we've seen built yet, right? If you can build circular products, the reason why you can't, actually doing qualified repair is still centralized, Apple will still verify the repair agent, is because we haven't built the open infrastructure for that warranty addition and self-warranty infrastructure. That, I think, is key to actually building some of this stuff. Other things I want to talk about are issues around, I think these are where it starts to get a little bit more foundational. I think one of the other big theses for me, and I want to put this in the room, and again, I wouldn't say this is concrete yet, but I do increasingly think that actually a lot of our logics and the way we perceive the world are based on the thesis of competition. Yet, actually, if you look at, say, collective intelligence, or you look at the thesis of data even, these are non-rivalrous products. These are not products that are based on rivalry, they're optimized by rivalry. They're based on products where actually collective value foundationally is more powerful. So if these are foundationally different economies, non-rivalrous economies, what is our thesis and our mechanisms of dealing with them? And I think one of the big challenges of the 21st century is there's a whole class of societal technologies emerging which require a foundationally different thesis, which is about non-rivalrous economics. And without building that, again, I think we will struggle to be able to drive some of that change. And that goes to data, collective intelligence, even some of the machine learning infrastructures that we're talking about. And then, in a way, the final point I think I want to sort of, in this part, is really talk about is that a lot of the thesis has been around what I would say is burning the red tape. So there's a kind of a, not in our worlds, but actually the kind of thesis of regulation is actually let's get rid of regulation. I would argue actually it's our ability to reimagine regulation. So if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, one of the key theses of the Industrial Revolution is that institutional innovation happened at the same time as technological innovation. And actually what made that happen, it was the combination of these things. Our ability to invent new institutions as well as build new technologies. In the 15th century, Gutenberg Press and other things, there were periods of time, actually in history, there were many technological leaps, but they were not followed by sustained growth. And the reason for it was fundamentally that actually we didn't do the institutional innovation. So if we want to drive change, it's really critical we imagine the institutions of the change that we require. And that is the only way we can fundamentally build the nature of the economy that we need and society that we need. So my plea is, what is the institutional infrastructures for a maintenance economy? And until we do that, I don't think we can scale this worldview into its depth, because I think everything is optimized for consumption and use at the institutional level. And that I think requires a foundationally different challenge. So all the way from rights, policy, contracting, these are all designed for consumption. And I think if we want to challenge that without setting up mechanisms of monopolies of power, right, I think we have to start to foundationally reimagine that economy. Now, going beyond this, I think some of the things that I'm particularly... I also think it's really key that we often talk about the economy in a singular sense. And the kind of final point I would say is actually there are perhaps different economies with different cycles. Renewable energy is a fundamentally different type of economy to organic or inorganic matter, which has to be fully circular if we're going to deal with it. Or organic matter, which actually has to return back to nature and actually fulfill a completer cycle with a third-party natural systems. Or an informational economy, which theoretically, yes, there is a computing cost to it, but theoretically is near zero cost, near zero. Not fully zero cost, to actually human development. These are foundationally different types of economies. Often we conflate their macroeconomic theory into a singular model. And unless we unpick them, we can't effectively manage the transition. So if we're going to talk about actually managing, the material economy and its effective transition to a low-impact world, yes, we're going to have to make it highly repairable, highly durable, and also highly circular. And we're going to have to minimize its use and construction in the first place. So these are cascades of effects that we have to do on that economy. Whereas organic material, actually what we have to do is take the nutrition cycle and the organic cycle and complete it. Now, and whereas the renewable energy economy, if we can get the model right, is effectively near infinite. So these are different economies with different architectures, and I think it's really important. But they all have to sit with a new relationship with our natural ecosystem. So the question is our natural ecosystem an infinite resource, uncosted, unbounded, that we can consume? Or does it have to be a self-sovereign entity, which we have to have a new relationship with? And what I think is fascinating is there are parts of the world, say in indigenous nations in Canada, there are now conversations going on about seeing the land as a self-sovereign entity and resource as self-sovereign, to which you have to have a relationship with, not an extraction capability, a relationship with, and circularity to. So is the primary holder of resource land as a living system to which we borrow and return back? And there is the monopoly value there rather than corporations. And it opens up really interesting architectures of effectively ownership, which transcend monopoly challenges. So I suppose that's where I want to end. And my kind of simple plea and simple conversation here is that in order to make this transition, we have to reimagine the institutions. We have to imagine as simple and boring as the receipt, because the receipt links to warranties. How do we do that? If we can't do that, I don't think we can actually transform the nature of what we consume, how we live, and how we buy. And it goes all the way down to even reconceiving how we perceive ourselves. And we've been psychologically engineered over the last 200 years to perceive ourselves as individuals. And the science of it is that we're not individuals. We're massively interdependent. We're actually multitudes of organisms inside us. It is a better pronoun for all of us to use the term we, they, them. That is greater truth than that for all of us to adopt that pronoun, because that is true for actually our reality, our biological lived realities. And so a transition requires at a cultural level, but also at an institutional level of how we imagine the world. I think that's key if we're going to deliver on the kind of scale of change that's necessary. With that, I thank you for your time. Thank you.